Hi, greetings from Abu Dhabi. My name is Samantha Neubauer, and today I want to talk about Namwali Serpell's short story, The Sack. The Sack was published in 2015, and in the same year it won the Kane Literature Prize. And this story's experimental structure is very compelling. It compelled me to actually seek out other work by Serpell before I recorded this booktube video. And the book I found in my institution's library was The Seven Modes of Uncertainty, which came out a year before The Sack. And this was Serpell's dissertation, her PhD dissertation. And this book is a challenge. It's a challenge if you haven't really been reading a lot of literary theory. As you might know, literary theory, specifically ethical literary criticism, of which this is, really pulls on a lot of different disciplines. And challenging works like that can be very invigorating to read, I've found, like during times of stress. And I'm actually in one of those times of stress right now as I'm waiting to hear back from some things. So I feel like this was a good choice for me. Also, because how Seven Modes of Uncertainty speaks to the short story that she wrote. Seven Modes of Uncertainty looks at contemporary literature and sees how the narrative structure evokes uncertainty in the reader. More than that, it looks how uncertainty plays out in literary ethics and how these ethics develop in a reader over time. If you're interested in any of this but not feeling the commitment for this book, there's a really good article by Serpell as well that was published, I think, about a year ago in the New York Review of Books, and it's called The Banality of Empathy. It's a play on the Haren Arendt title, The Banality of Evil. And what that really looks at is this kind of age-old question of like, what does literature do for us? And I really wish I had read kind of this article that is super accessible early on in my literary career, because I think it's really easy to say that literature instills empathy in us. I think it's kind of the go-to remark by young scholars of literature, kind of by people who like pick up a book here and there, by most people. And you see a lot of pop psychology articles like that, like how literature makes you better people, which even as a young person never made complete sense to me, because like writers themselves aren't always like good people. So I didn't understand how like reading like the thoughts and thinking of someone that was also like not always good made you better. But I do feel that Serpell lays out like a really good argument for how uncertainty like can lead to like more like experiences of ethical thinking that are outside you, that make you more aware of how like others' experiences are, in a way that's not the same as empathy, even though it like might sound like empathy. But along with empathy, I think comes this idea that, you know, we're all the same. But what about when we're not, right? What does it mean then? And so I definitely like don't read literature to find sameness. And I think a lot of people kind of outgrow that motive for literature too. And like once you outgrow that, like what do you expect to get out of literature? And one idea is that reading a lot of literature leads to empathy, which leads to moral action. And people like Bloom and like lots of other literary theorists like also dismantle that notion. So then the question really becomes like, what does literature do for you? How this relates to the sack, though, is that the sack is really cerebral. It's an exercise in thinking about structure and uncertainty in a story form, so you can kind of approach these ideas in a different way. What I really liked about the sack was that it can almost be read as a palindrome. The eponymous sack in it is actually attached to a dream sequence that appears 3 times in the structure. But the story itself centers around 3 characters. Those characters are just someone named Jay, the initial, an old man, the other one is called, and then a young boy. And what Serpell has said, I have a nice quote by her, is that her characters' identities in this story are formed through their relationships opposed to standing outside of it, which I think is really fascinating as someone who serves in a teaching assistant type role every fall on a course called Identity. And we're constantly trying to like deconstruct what this word means, what is essential about it, and what is constructed about it. And it actually reminded me of if any of you speak Mandarin or have studied Chinese, you'll do family members and family relations probably in your first year. I know I did when I was studying the language. And you quickly realize that there are different terminology for your relationship you have with different members of your family. For example, your brother, if your brother is younger, as I have a younger brother, I would call him Didi. If my brother is older, he's Gaga. And this is very true for all the family dynamics throughout the kind of the family tree. And I think Serpell is doing something like that in the sack, where she is basing the identities of folks on their relationship with each other. So with the old man and Jay, for instance, we learn that they have been friends their whole lives, but now they're old men, okay? One of them, though, is the master to the other one, which is super fascinating, too, because that wasn't always the case. So this story also speaks to kind of the uncertainty in relationships we have and the changing nature of relationships over time. What comes about is one of these men has become indebted to the other, and he must take care of him. The boy figure in the story confused me a bit, but I think it might have something to do with also that servant-master relationship, because you're not sure if he's really working for one of the men, or if he might be kind of the bastard son of one of the men, or if he's like a figment of the imagination. You're never quite sure. The sack. So the sack is really interesting because in the opening dream sequence, one of the men, again, we're not sure who, is having a dream of a sack. And he's seeing the sack from the outside and kind of describing it, okay? And then you go back to like what's happening in real time, right? The servant and master relationship, one taking care of the other because one of the men is ill. Okay. Then we go back to the dream sequence again. And in the dream sequence now, the man is inside the sack, okay? And that's really fascinating, like kind of the aesthetics and the sensory experience of being inside the sack. Then we go back into the realist narrative structure again. And the young boy and one of the men are deboning a fish, okay? And then we have the third dream sequence, and we're seeing one of the men dragging the sack off, presumably a body inside the sack. So we're playing a lot here with POV. There's first and third POV in here. But also the sack itself, from these different kind of modes of entry, could also relate to the story and how we experience the story. And it's also super unsettling. I think what really works about here is, I'll go back to that word palindrome that we, English speakers, we all learn when we're young, race car, things like that, spelled the same forward and backwards. Because what I was compelled to do after reading the story was to go back and reread it backwards. And it works. And it works in a way that most stories wouldn't be able to work, because how the dialogue works in the story is that if you read it backwards, it flips who is saying what. And Also, you could read it backwards in different ways. You could read it backwards so that you're reading it line by line backwards, okay? Or you could read it backwards by starting each paragraph and reading it backwards. Or you could read it from the end, almost like it was one of those towels that you see at in the washroom that kind of goes in a circle, and read it from the end and then start at the beginning. It works in all these different ways. It really gives you a lot of autonomy as a reader. And I think what Serpell is doing here is very experimental, and very fun to look at from like a craft point of view, from someone who loves to read point of view, thinking about how literature is structured, thinking about how we deal again with uncertainty in literature. What I think the story suffers from, though, however, is a lack of character. So I really do like stories with that kind of mysterious idea of voice. And this story has voice, but I wasn't invested enough in the characters themselves. I was more invested in the structure of the story and how the structure was working. And it's hard for me as someone who writes to know that if someone who doesn't write read this story, would they have felt as compelled by the structure as I did? Or would they kind of think, oh, this is interesting, I like this, but I really just wish that I knew more about the characters. I think this is one of those stories that you could say is a writer's story. Like, people will really like this if they're studying the craft of writing. That's not to say that this story is somehow is inaccessible. It's like super accessible. It's just, for me, it lacked kind of someone to root for. And I guess ultimately what you should be doing is rooting for their relationship, since the two main characters' identity is not that filled out and based on kind of their individual characteristics. So definitely check out Serpell's work. And also, in the Banality of Empathy article, she mentions some other experimental short stories, which are really great as well. So I really want to invest some time in reading more experimental literature this year, and seeking out writers from the African continent that aren't just from Nigeria and South Africa. I think those writers from the continent get a lot more press time than writers from other parts of the continent.